If I told you that in New York there is a town that seems to live side by side with a headless horseman, a place called North Pole that actually exists, and a village where people go digging for diamonds, even though what they find are not real diamonds, you might think these were just made-up stories for fun, but they are not. These places are real, and what makes them memorable is not just that. They each contain something strange. It is that each town seems to carry a mood that is hard to explain, as if it drifted out of New York's normal rhythm a long time ago. Today we are going to travel through the 10 weirdest towns in New York, and the deeper we go into this list, the clearer that feeling becomes. Number 10. Alexandria Bay. Alexandria Bay does not feel like the kind of place that should exist in New York. It is a tiny village in Jefferson County, up in the Thousand Islands, along the St. Lawrence River, right near the US-Canada border, with only around 900 people. On paper, that sounds small, quiet, almost easy to miss. But the second you look out across the water, the whole place starts to feel strange in the best possible way. Because sitting out there on Hart Island is Bolt Castle, a 120-room mansion that looks less like upstate New York and more like a piece of Europe that somehow drifted into the river and never left. And that is what makes Alexandria Bay belong on this list. The weird part is not just that it has a castle. The weird part is that the castle changes the entire identity of the town around it. In most places, a local landmark stays a landmark. Here, it becomes the atmosphere. It changes the way the shoreline feels. It changes the way the town is remembered. It even changes the way people imagine this little village before they ever arrive. That feeling gets even stranger when you know the story behind it. Bolt Castle began in the early 1900s when hotel magnate George C. Bolt set out to build this grand summer home for his wife, Louise. So now, Alexandria Bay is not just a small river village. It is a small river village carrying around the outline of a love story, a fantasy, and a half-unreal old-world image that feels way too oversized for a place this small. Without the river, it would still be a northern New York village. Without the islands, it would still be scenic. But with that castle rising out of the St. Lawrence, Alexandria Bay stops feeling ordinary. It starts feeling staged, almost theatrical, like the town itself has been pulled slightly out of America's usual rhythm. That is why Alexandria Bay is weird in the right way for this list. Not because there is one strange thing sitting inside it, but because the whole town feels like it lives in the shadow of something far grander, older, and more European than it should. Number 9. Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow is weird in a way that almost feels unfair to every other town in New York, because this place did not just end up with a famous legend. It let that legend take over the entire mood of the town. Sitting along the Hudson in Westchester County, about 28 miles north of Midtown Manhattan, Sleepy Hollow is only a village of roughly 10,000 to 11,000 people. That is not a huge place, but somehow it carries one of the biggest shadows in American storytelling. And that shadow, of course, is the Headless Horseman. Most towns have a local ghost story somewhere in the background. Sleepy Hollow feels like the opposite. Here, the ghost story is the background. Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, first published in 1820, did not just borrow the name, it helped define the identity of the place itself. The Old Dutch Church and its burying ground, which date back to the late 1600s, are tied directly to the story. And the nearby cemetery later became the resting place of Irving himself. So in Sleepy Hollow, literature, folklore, and the physical landscape all start blending together until the town feels less like a setting and more like the story still never really left. And then it gets even stranger. This village was not always officially called Sleepy Hollow. For most of the 20th century, it was North Tarrytown. But in 1996, residents voted to rename it Sleepy Hollow, basically embracing the legend so completely that the town made it part of its legal identity. That detail matters because it proves this place is not weird just because of one old tale. It is weird because the tale got absorbed into the town's real life, real branding, and real sense of self. You can feel that most of all in the fall when Halloween season turns the village into something that almost feels staged for the world to see. Parades, haunted attractions, ghost tours, headless horseman imagery, old churches, graveyards, autumn streets. It stops feeling like a normal Hudson Valley village and starts feeling like a town that lives side by side with its own myth. That is why Sleepy Hollow belongs on this list. Not because it has a legend inside it, but because the whole town seems to breathe through that legend. Number 8, Coxsackie. Coxsackie is one of those towns that can stop a viewer before the story even starts. Because before people know where it is, before they know what it looks like, before they know anything about its history, they usually react to the name first. And that alone already makes this place feel different from almost every other town in New York. Set in Greene County along the west side of the Hudson River, with the village itself holding only around 2,700 people. Coxsackie is not some giant place trying to market itself into being memorable. It is a small river community with a very old name that sounds unusual, looks unusual, and somehow feels like it came from an entirely different map. That is what makes Coxsackie work for a list like this, because the weirdness here is not built around one castle, one ghost story, or one festival that takes over a weekend. The weirdness is built right into the identity of the town itself. The name traces back to indigenous roots, usually linked to Algonquin language, and over time it passed through many spellings and many interpretations. Depending on which version of the history you follow, it has been connected to meanings like place of owls, migrating geese, or even cut rocks. That matters because it gives Coxsackie a kind of layered weirdness. The name is not only striking, it is also old, slippery, and hard to pin down, like the town has been carrying around a word that history never fully settled. And that creates a very specific kind of atmosphere. Coxsackie does not feel weird because it is trying too hard. It feels weird because it is completely real, completely lived in, and still somehow sounds like a place people would assume was made up the first time they hear it. Down by the Hudson with its old streets and rivertown character, it has the bones of a classic New York community. But then that name keeps hovering over everything, making the whole place feel just a little offbeat, a little older, a little less ordinary than the towns around it. That is why Coxsackie belongs on this list. Not because there is one strange thing inside it, but because the town itself enters the conversation already sounding like a mystery. Number 7. Skaneateles. Skaneateles is the kind of town that makes winter feel slightly unreal. For most of the year, it is a small village of about 2,500 people in Onondaga County, sitting right on the northern tip of Skaneateles Lake in the Finger Lakes region, not far from Syracuse. On paper, that sounds calm, scenic, even predictable. But every holiday season, this place stops feeling like a normal New York village and starts feeling like it slipped through a crack in time. Because in Skaneateles, Christmas does not just arrive, it performs. The village's Dickens Christmas event has become so woven into the place that it no longer feels like one attraction inside the town. It feels like the town itself putting on another identity. The streets fill with Victorian characters, carolers appear, horse-drawn carriage and wagon rides roll through downtown. Scenes inspired by A Christmas Carol play out in public, not tucked away on some distant stage, but right there among the shops, sidewalks, and lakefront streets. New York State's Tourism Office describes it as a street theater production that brings Dickens to life on weekends from just after Thanksgiving through Christmas Eve. And that is what makes Skaneateles weird in the right way for this list. A lot of towns have holiday festivals. Skaneateles feels different because the event does not sit on top of the village. It takes over the village's mood. It changes the pace of the streets. It changes the way people imagine the town. Once the costumes, carriages, and old-fashioned performances arrive, Skaneateles no longer feels like just another pretty lake village in upstate New York. It starts to feel like a place where modern life quietly steps aside for something older, warmer, and much more theatrical. That transformation works so well because the village already looks like it was built to hold that illusion. It has a historic downtown, a postcard lake setting, and the kind of compact main street that can suddenly feel intimate and storybook when winter closes in. So when Dickens' Christmas arrives, it does not feel forced. It feels like the town was somehow waiting for it. That is why Skaneateles belongs here. Not because it hosts a charming holiday event, but because for a few weeks every winter, the whole town seems to become a living Dickens world. Number 6. Tupper Lake. Tupper Lake is weird in a quieter, smarter way than some of the other towns on this list. It is not weird because it looks haunted. It is not weird because of some outrageous legend. It is weird because it took one of the most familiar things in upstate New York, the forest, and somehow turned it into something that feels half nature, half imagination. Sitting in Franklin County inside Adirondack Park, west of Lake Placid, Tupper Lake is a village of only about 3,300 people. On the surface, it sounds like the kind of place you would expect to be all about mountains, lakes, cabins, and long winters. And in some ways, it is. This is a real Adirondack community shaped by the old rhythms of logging, rail, and outdoor life. But that is only the surface. Because Tupper Lake is also the kind of town where the woods do not just surround you. They get redesigned into an experience. That is what the Wild Center and especially Wild Walk have done to the identity of this place. Wild Walk is not just a scenic boardwalk in the trees, it is an elevated trail through the Adirondack canopy with a giant treehouse, swinging bridges, a huge spider web people can climb on, and a full-scale eagle's nest that lets you stand above the forest like you somehow belong there. It feels less like a normal attraction and more like somebody asked what would happen if a science museum, a playground, and a dream about the forest all got built in the same place. And that changes the way Tupper Lake feels as a town. In a lot of mountain communities, nature is something you look at. In Tupper Lake, nature becomes something you enter from a completely different angle. You do not just hike through the woods here, you rise into them. You see them from the height of branches, from the perspective of a child, an animal, and a curious adult all at once. That gives the town a strange kind of personality. It still feels rustic and rooted, but it also feels experimental, like this small Adirondack village decided the forest did not have to stay on the ground. That is why Tupper Lake belongs on this list. Not because it has one unusual attraction, but because the whole town carries the identity of a place where nature has been turned into an idea you can actually walk through. Number 5. Lake Placid. Lake Placid is weird because it feels way too important for its size. This is not some giant winter city built around sports. It is a village of only about 2,200 people in Essex County, tucked into the Adirondacks near North Elba. On a map, it looks small. In real life, it is small. But somehow, this little mountain village carries the kind of name that belongs to world events, not quiet communities. That contrast is the whole reason it belongs on this list, because Lake Placid is not just a pretty resort town with snow and scenery, it is one of the very few places on Earth that has hosted the Winter Olympics twice, once in 1932 and again in 1980. That alone already gives the village a strange kind of scale. Most towns this size are lucky to be known for one local tradition, one festival, maybe one postcard view. Lake Placid somehow ended up carrying Olympic history on its shoulders, as if a global event got dropped into a place built for a much smaller life. And then there is the moment that pushed it beyond history and into myth, the miracle on ice. In 1980, the U.S. men's hockey team defeated the Soviet Union at the Olympic Center on the way to gold, and that game never really left the town. It is not just a memory hidden in a museum somewhere. The official legacy site still centers that rink and the story attached to it, which means Lake Placid does not merely remember its Olympic past. It still lives inside it. That is what makes the village feel so unusual. In most places, a famous event happens, people put up a plaque, and life moves on. Mountain in Lake Placid, the Olympic identity stayed. The village still has a network of Olympic legacy sites, including the Olympic Center, the Olympic Jumping Complex, and Mount Van Hoevenberg, all of which keep the place tied to competition, training, and spectacle long after the torch went out. It makes the whole town feel like a mountain village wearing an Olympic uniform it never took off. Number 4. Roscoe is weird because it feels like a town that picked one obsession and never looked back. This is not a city with a fishing district. It is not a mountain town that happens to have a good stream nearby. Roscoe, tucked into Sullivan County in the Catskills, is a hamlet of only about 500 people, and yet it carries a nickname so specific it almost sounds like a joke: Trout Town, USA. The strange part is, the town has spent so long living inside that identity that it no longer sounds exaggerated. It sounds accurate. In most places, fishing is an activity. In Roscoe, it feels more like citizenship. The town sits right where the Beaver Kill and Willoweemot Creek come together at the famous Junction Pool, one of the names that keeps showing up whenever people talk about classic fly fishing water in the Catskills. Even the local tourism material leans hard into it, framing Roscoe as a dream destination for anglers with 5 top trout streams surrounding the community. That means the trout identity here is not a side note. It is the town's public face. And once you notice that, you start seeing how deep it goes. The guides, the fly shops, the events, the rituals of opening day, they all make Roscoe feel less like a place that offers fishing and more like a place organized around it. Even the calendar tells the story. The annual first Castro edition happens at Junction Pool itself, marking the start of trout season like it is practically a civic holiday. That is not normal town behavior. That is a community building part of its rhythm around fish, water, and the people who come chasing both. Then the identity spills into everything else. Roscoe Beer Company leans into local lore with its two-headed stout, inspired by the legend of the two-headed trout of Junction Pool. So now the trout do not just shape the rivers. They shape the beer, the stories, and the way Roscoe talks about itself. That is why Roscoe is weird in exactly the right way for this list. Not because there is one odd thing sitting inside town limits, but because the entire hamlet feels like a place where trout somehow became the local language. Number 3, Old North Pole. North Pole is one of those places that sounds fake even when it is real. The name alone already does half the work. You hear it and your brain immediately assumes this has to be some roadside joke or a seasonal nickname. But North Pole is an actual hamlet in the Adirondacks, in the town of Wilmington in Essex County, sitting near Whiteface Mountain and about 12 miles from Lake Placid. It is tiny, quiet, and very real, which somehow makes it even weirder. Because once you get past the name, you realize the town did not stop at borrowing the idea of Christmas. It built itself around it. The strange part is not just that it has Santa's workshop. The strange part is that Santa's workshop has shaped the way the whole hamlet is imagined. New York State Tourism describes North Pole as a real hamlet in the state's northeast corner and points visitors straight towards Santa's workshop, which it calls one of the nation's oldest theme parks. The official park site says it opened in 1949 and presents the place as the home of Santa Claus, his reindeer, and his helpers. So this is not just a town with a Christmas attraction inside it. It is a tiny Adirondack hamlet whose public identity has been pulled almost completely into Christmas orbit, and that changes the entire mood of the place. In most towns, holiday decorations show up for a few weeks and then disappear. In North Pole, the fantasy is built into the name, the map, the local story, and the reason most outsiders know the place exists at all. Santa's workshop is described as a vintage Christmas village, filled with Santa's helpers, theme shops, rides, and a world designed to feel like the North Pole somehow landed in northern New York. That gives the hamlet a strange kind of permanence. Christmas is not visiting this place. It has already moved in, not because there is one festive thing hidden in town limits, but because the whole hamlet feels like it let Christmas write its identity for it and never asked for it back. Number 2. Middleville. Middleville is weird because it turns one of the oldest fantasies in America into something you can actually do with a hammer. This is not some flashy resort town or oversized tourist strip. It is a tiny village in Herkimer County, sitting along West Canada Creek in central New York with only about 400 people. That is exactly what makes it feel so strange. A place this small should be easy to miss. Instead, it is tied to one of the most memorable treasure hunt identities in the whole state. Because Middleville lives in the orbit of the Herkimer diamond mines. And the first twist is right there in the name. These are not actual diamonds. They are double-terminated quartz crystals, famous for their clarity and shape, formed roughly 500 million years ago. But they look just convincing enough and sound just magical enough that generations of visitors have kept showing up to dig for them anyway. That is what gives Middleville its odd little power. It is a real village with a real geologic story, but the way people remember it feels closer to folklore than science. And once you lean into that, the whole town starts to feel different. In most places, geology stays in the background. In Middleville, geology becomes the town's personality. The official mine describes above-ground surface mining where people break open rock to uncover these crystals, and anything they find is theirs to keep. New York State tourism pushes the same idea right down to visitors sifting for quartz crystals, camping on site, and walking away with their haul. So this is not just a village near an unusual attraction, it is a village wrapped around the promise that ordinary people can show up, dig into stone, and maybe leave feeling like they found treasure. That is why Middleville belongs on this list. Not because there is one odd stop sitting nearby, but because the place itself feels tied to a very specific dream. That somewhere in a quiet little New York village you can crack open a rock and find something bright enough to make the whole trip feel legendary. In a state full of famous towns, Middleville stands out for building part of its identity around diamonds that are not diamonds, and somehow making that feel even more memorable. Number 1. Neversink. Neversink is weird in the deepest way a town can be weird, because the strangest thing about it is not what was built there. It is what was erased. Today, Neversink is a town of about 3,400 people in Sullivan County, stretching into the Catskills. If you only looked at it on a map, it would seem like one more quiet upstate town. But Neversink carries a story that immediately changes the way you see it. This is a place whose original village was moved and then drowned so New York City could drink. That is what makes Neversink belong at number 1. In most towns, the center of the story is still standing. In Neversink, the most powerful part of the story is underwater. The town's own history explains that the original village of Neversink was relocated to its present site along Route 55, while the waters of the Rondout Reservoir covered the old communities of Neversink and Bittersweet. That means this is not just a town near a reservoir. It is a town whose identity was permanently reshaped by the loss of its first home. And the reason that happened makes the whole story feel even heavier. The Rondout Reservoir became a key part of New York City's Delaware water supply system, with work beginning in 1937 and water delivery starting in 1951. Accounts tied specifically to the flooded town place, the final inundation in the early 1950s, often around 1953. So the original Neversink was not swallowed by a natural disaster or a random accident. It was sacrificed during the mid-20th century to serve the needs of a much bigger city far away. What gives that sacrifice real emotional weight is that the old village was not empty land. Historical descriptions of old Neversink point to a real small-town life with a main street, a church, a post office, a schoolhouse, and even a covered bridge before the reservoir came. That is the detail that stays with you. People did not lose a patch of geography. They lost a lived-in place with routines, landmarks, and memory. Not because there is one strange thing inside the town, but because the town itself lives with a contradiction almost no place can match. It still exists, but the version of it that feels most real is the part lying beneath the water. So after all that, maybe the strangest thing about New York is not the skyline, not the subway, not even the city everyone thinks they already know. Maybe it is the fact that beyond all of that, this state is hiding places like these. Towns with castles that look misplaced, villages that live inside old legends, communities built around trout, Christmas, fake diamonds, and even one place whose original heart is now underwater. And that is what makes these towns so memorable. They are not weird because they are trying to be. They are weird because over time, history, folklore, geography, obsession, and identity all piled up in one small place and turned it into something you do not forget. Honestly, that is what makes New York feel bigger than people think, not just in size, but in personality. Because once you leave the obvious places behind, you start finding towns that feel like their own little worlds. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these towns felt the weirdest to you? And more importantly, which one would you actually want to visit first? If you enjoyed this countdown, drop your pick in the comments and stick around because there are a lot more strange little corners of America still waiting to be explored.